So we're back for another episode, a four-part series on hope, and Ian Hearne has kindly offered to speak. Well, I asked you, didn't I, Ian? I approached you, and I should just introduce of how we met actually, because we were my best friend and I were away for a weekend in Bradford, and we went to Smith Wigglesworth's granddaughter's church, and you happened to be there, which we didn't know. The vicar of Baghdad, who's known in the press, but actually whose actual name is Andrew White Cannon, was also there. And when you spoke, I really felt in my heart that I needed to ask you if you'd be willing to be interviewed. And I kind of came up to you, didn't I? And just kind of went, oh, and you looked at me very kindly and generously and said, yes, I would be willing to be interviewed. And that's led us to here. And we've had many conversations in between about your testimony and some of the stories you're going to share as well, underpinning it with hope. And, I wanted to bring an array of stories really in. We've had Dr. Richard Scott talking about the medical aspect of hope, but for you, you've been in some extreme situations, life and death situations. And how does one anchor oneself when faced with death? And I'm not going to steal your thunder, as that they say, but really, I wanted to bring your story to the forefront. So, thank you for agreeing, and tell everyone who you are and what you do, and a bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, delighted to be asked to speak with you, and yes, it was quite fortuitous us meeting back. It was a month ago now or so, I guess. But as you've already introduced me, Ian Hearne, I'm a former Royal Marine, and I worked in, having left the Royal Marines, I worked in Baghdad, running a private security company, and as part of that operation, I ran into Canon Andrew White, as you've already said, the vicar of Baghdad, and was able to visit on many occasions his church in Iraq, in Baghdad, St. George's Church, and from there we've become great friends. But I think if I go back and explain just a little bit more, I was brought up, both my parents are Christians and had actually trained to be missionaries. And unfortunately, they didn't make it to South America as was planned. But they were still very much heavily involved in church. And at one point, my father became an elder of a church in Exeter in Devon. And I would have been about 5 years old, I guess. And we moved as a family down to Exeter. And at the weekend, we would travel to Exmouth, to the seaside. And every time we went to Exmouth, we would pass the Royal Marine training camp at Lympstone. And age 5, I declared that that's what I was going to do when I grew up. I was going to join the Royal Marines. And also at that time, there was a Christian conference centre just outside Exeter near Newton Abbot. And it was run by a family called the Fords, Christine and Malcolm Ford, and their children were my age and my sister's age. And it was great to be able to go to this farm, and whilst the adults were in the conference and listening to various Christian speakers from around the country, the children would be left to their own devices to go and play in the fields and the woods. And it was pretty much like famous Five type scenario. And I mentioned that because cut forward to, I joined the Marines age 16. I served for nearly 8-9 years in the Royal Marines, and did various different jobs once I left the Marines. But more importantly, I suppose the one of most significance is running the private security company in Iraq, and that's where, as I say, we met Andrew White. And I was back from Iraq and visiting some friends down in Devon, and my sister said to me, I wondered if we could find that Christian conference centre, Rora Farm. I said, well, I'm 50 now. There's no way I could remember, even know where this conference centre would be. But we knew it was near Newton Abbot, and we pulled off the A38 and just got to the top of the slip road. And sure enough, there was a sign saying Rora Farm Christian Conference Centre. And we followed the sign, and we were there. After about 10 minutes of driving through the small country lanes, we happened across Rora Farm. And it was just as we remembered when we were 6 years old, 7 years old. But as we walked in, I said, I don't suppose Malcolm or Christine Ford are still here. And this little voice in the background said, yes. He said, I'm Malcolm. I said, you probably won't remember me. It's Ian Hearne. Oh, he said, come in, come in. And he said, what a fantastic surprise to see you. And he had a book in his hand. I said, what's that book you're reading? He said, oh, you've got to read this. It's called Faith Under Fire by the Vicar of Baghdad. He said, have you heard of him? I said, heard of him? I've been looking after him for the last 7 years in Iraq. And that's, those coincidences and things like that. That's just one example, but many coincidences have happened throughout my life. And you asked,
Ian, just before you continue, I want to ask a question. Why not follow the pathway of your father and go into ministry? Why go into, the army, the Royal Marines, and
Well, it's a good point. As I say, that wanting to be in the Marines stemmed back to passing the barracks on a weekend and seeing the Marines there. But when I was about 9 years old, we moved back from Devon to Yorkshire, and when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my parents separated. And there was this family that had been heavily involved in church. Everything evolved around the church: prayer meetings, Bible studies, church services on Sunday, sometimes three times a day on Sunday. And as a child, that was my life, that was my upbringing. And when my parents separated, that was monumental to me, and it shattered my belief system, if you like. And I guess joining the Marines was one way in which I was able to almost run away from what had been quite a strict upbringing in that respect. So I found myself actually trying to move away from God and move away from church. But sorry, I thought I'd turn this off. What became apparent was that the more I tried to move away from the church and from Christ, the more I would be pulled back. And that actually leads me into another example, which is something that you and I had spoke about.
Yeah.
I'd gone on holiday to Greece. I was in Rhodes, and I was wearing a Royal Marine T-shirt. And this was just after the Bosnia conflict, and there was all sorts of ethnic groups working in Rhodes, and some of the drivers, the taxi drivers, were Croatian or Bosnian or whatever. And they saw my T-shirt that said Royal Marines, and they took an instant dislike to me, and I was severely beaten up. I was involved in a fight, and knocked unconscious. In fact, if it hadn't have been for a group of guys from Liverpool that just happened to be passing, I would have, no doubt, I think I would have been kicked to death. And I ended up in hospital in Rhodes town. And the doctor stitched me up and sent me back to the hotel. And the next morning, the police arrived. And they obviously could see that I was in a bad way. And they said, I need you to go to the police station to give a statement. And I said, no, it's okay. It's fine. Don't worry. And they said, no, you've got to come with us. And they frog marched me to a waiting car and took me to the police station. And I knew instantly that this wasn't for me to give a statement, that this was something else was going on. And they took me to a police cell, and I was told I was going to prison for 10 days. and why I don't know, but as they led me into a courtyard and the police Land Rover was reversing in, I suppose my marine instinct kicked in, and I actually managed to escape from the police and ran and got out of the police station. I probably only got about 300 yards, and I was caught by the police, and this time dragged back into the cell, and I was given a severe beating, and I ended up in hospital. And I managed to get a message to my friend that I was on holiday with, and he was able to visit me the next day. But during that night, I had a catheter in, I had a drip in my arm, and I thought, this is, this is, I'm in real trouble here. I remember getting off the bed, kneeling at the side of the bed, and praying. And as sure as I'm having this conversation with you, a voice said to me, "You only come to me when you need something, but I am your Father, and I'm here for you all the time." And I knew it was God speaking to me, and and I was extremely humbled, and I managed to get back into bed. And the next day, my friend arrived, and he said, "Well, the police have got your passport." He said, "We can't leave. You've got your passport." But he somehow got a message at the hotel telling him that he needed to go to the police station, which was outside of Rhodes Town. And he drove, he said, about 20 minutes into the hills above Rhodes. And he said it was a one-horse town, and there was a little hut that said police above it. And he walked in, there was nobody around, but my passport was on the desk. And he collected the passport, and we managed to book a flight home, and I was home. And I absolutely no doubt whatsoever that was God's intervention. Yeah. And when we talk about hope, that's what God gives us. And there's been many times, not just that, but certainly in my time during the Marines and in Iraq, where when you're up against it, that old saying, "There's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole," is really true, because you find yourself on your knees praying to God, because that is the only time you get any hope and any faith. And it's through that, and through those constantly being brought back to God, that renewed my faith. And from that boy that was running away, I am the person I am today.
And I love that, Ian, how you've been very clear about how you moved away from your faith. Not entirely, I don't believe, because we've spoken several times, in between this interview, and we'll continue to speak, I have no doubt. But there was always something there, I believe, for you. And I think that you've hit something there. It's not until we're faced with serious situations, in your case, life and death, that we get on our knees and pray and anchor ourselves into that hope. And again, I'm reminded when, someone's taken a instant dislike to you wearing that T-shirt. And it just reminded me of sometimes when stories in the Bible, especially, in the days when leading up to Jesus's arrest and crucifixion, and he only had to rock up in a room, right? And then people would start reacting and all the rest of it. So it's just interesting that, you've experienced some of that. But you've gone on to be a successful businessman. You're writing your first book, to help others with your wisdom and knowledge. Talk to us about, there's people watching right now who are seeking hope, who may not know what hope is or where they start from someone who's been through, what to me sounds like a James Bond movie, but is your reality. Talk to us about how we can anchor ourselves in hope and a climate where we're constantly being told, oh, we're in a cost of living crisis. Oh, we're not going to have enough water in 10 years. Oh, no, all this fear mongering that's going on around us. What would you say, Ian?
Well, I think it's interesting the way you've said you phrased that, and this passage that came to me, it was Jeremiah 29:11, and it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And those words were given to me, and that give you hope and a future, and it always reminded me, and it always brought me back to earth, if you like, to say that our future, we're only here for a short time. Our future is in heaven. Our future is with the Lord, and unless we accept that and accept God as our Savior, then we have no future. And what God does is, it says there, plans to give you hope and a future, and that's what He does. And I was fortunate, as I say, in meeting Andrew White, and just that story, incidentally. I was a sales and marketing director for a company, a large multinational company, and earning a very reasonable salary, and but I was quite bored, and I was on a night out in Manchester, and I met a guy called Andy Edwards, and I heard this conversation going on at the side of me, and I thought, these guys have got to be ex-forces. And I introduced myself. I said, I don't suppose you're ex-forces by any chance? They said, yeah, we're ex-Royal Marines. I said, where were you based? And they said, Poole in Dorset. And Poole is the home of the Special Boat Service. So I knew straight away that these guys were not just Royal Marines. They were the creme de la creme. These guys were the SAS equivalent, if you like. And we swapped business cards. And Andy said, I've got a business out in Iraq, and it's a private security company, and I might have to come to you to give me some pointers at some stage. I said, yeah, give me a call anytime. And I got home, and on the Sunday evening, that was on the Saturday, and on the Sunday evening, there was a documentary by Raghi Omar, the journalist, Channel 4 journalist, who was had a program on, a documentary about Canon Andrew White, the Vicar of Baghdad. And I was sat at home watching this documentary, thinking, this man's an idiot. He's running a church, a Christian church, where in the center of Baghdad, one of the most dangerous places on earth. And he's been kidnapped, don't know how many times, he's been shot at, he's been blown up. Why on earth would he want to be out in Baghdad? And the next day, I got a phone call from Andy Edwards, and he said, I've just looked at your card again, and business development. Would you come out to Baghdad and help me run this business? And a week later, I was sat having a cup of tea with Andrew White in Baghdad. Again, that's another coincidence, but it's the way that my life has gone. And I was able to visit St. George's Church. And when we had guests or clients, as they were, in Iraq, and things were quite tough, and Andrew White came to visit the villa that we lived in. Mm-hmm. And I announced to our clients that I was having Andrew White come over, and if anybody heard of him, he'd be doing communion. Well, the place was packed. These so-called non-believers suddenly, were scared in Iraq. They were scared, even though we were looking after them. I might say something more about my security than anything else, but they flocked into the meeting room, and Andrew White delivered communion, and our villa was pre-owned by the head of Saddam Hussein's secret police, a man responsible for the murder and torture of literally hundreds of people, if not thousands. An evil man. And there we were in his dining room having communion by Andrew White. And that you raised questions with people who said, well, what is it? What is it that Christianity is? Tell us more. And one of the guys that we worked closely with was a guy called Brian Barnes, and he was ex-CIA.
Right.
And he said to me, "Well, I don't think God will ever forgive me. I've done some pretty bad things." And he was, I won't say too much, but he was involved in what was called black operations for the CIA. And he said, "I know God might be able to forgive him, but I can't live with the guilt." And I was able to introduce him to Andrew White and speak with him myself, but certainly Andrew played a major part in talking to him. And I'm pleased to say that now Brian Barnes, 5 years later, is training to be a priest in America, and is shortly to be ordained. So that's how God works. And if that isn't giving you hope, then I don't know what will.
Do you know, Ian, I think people are searching, they're searching for hope, and there's a lot of people that believe there's something bigger than us out there. But there's a lot of noise around that as well, which we've talked about, which is probably for another episode. But I mean, wow, you guys were going into a war-torn country, sitting in an evil dictator's house, ministering and doing Holy Communion. And that's just so powerful. And as a result, you know, people from the CIA were coming to you and asking, what I want, hope, give me hope that, you know, I'm living with this guilt, and you guys were doing that. I mean, you must have so many stories.
My life has been a series of coincidences, and you know, there comes a time when you say, well, it isn't coincidence. This is God's plan. And I go back to Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. And I've always, realized that these aren't just coincidences. These are the plans that God has set aside for me. And the struggle, if there has been, has been to surrender myself and say, okay, then I'm yours, Lord. Do what you need.
And I'm intrigued in from a well-being perspective. You've been through a lot. You've been through traumatic situations, chaotic situations. How do you manage your well-being on a day-to-day?
Well, having a relationship with God is the first thing, isn't it? And being able to pray and have that conversation. I think we talked the other day about, you know, structure and for some people, perhaps starting off in as a Christian, that might be the case. But I think the more you read the Bible and go to church and mix with people that are Christians, then the more praying becomes a conversation, and a happy conversation, and you can speak to God at any time or anywhere. And certainly that has kept me sane.
Yeah. And I know that you've got a good family around you as well, and good support, and humor helps as well. And you certainly have one of those, don't you? So thank you, Ian. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And sharing, a very small portion of your journey, but, you know, journeys continue. And we wish you all the best and hope to see you back soon.
And likewise yourself, and look forward to speaking again soon.